And in order to change the spur gear, I have to take out the whole transmission. Hello folks, welcome to Netcruzer RC. We're going to talk about the Kyosho Outlaw Rampage Pro today and a couple of maintenance things or repairs that you're likely going to have to make if you get one of these, specifically with the gearbox and the gears. So if you saw my first video of the run on this, you will see that I stripped out the spur gear first run. And fairly common fault with these. Thankfully, it is only the spur gear that I stripped. I have the transmission out. I will show you the status of the other gears, but it is potential that you could strip out the whole gearbox. While I was waiting for the gears to come in, I started the tear apart process. So I already have the transmission off. Getting the transmission off of the chassis is actually fairly simple. It was maybe 4 to 6 screws, and then the whole transmission just comes off because it just hangs off these trailing arms, a couple of mount points, top and bottom, and then you just remove the whole transmission. And then the whole transmission and the axle comes out in one piece. Now I've already taken it half apart. Here's the main axle. In order to get this part off, you have to take the end caps off. Then you can split the gearbox case. This is how you see it from in the chassis, where you have a couple little access ports to get at your slipper tightness and to be able to sometimes maybe adjust your motor mesh, but it's really not really well designed for that. My biggest problem with this whole case design is this outer cover. It has almost no access to anything for maintenance, because normally you would want to be able to take off this whole outer section to be able to get out of spur gear. The only thing that went wrong in this whole thing is that the spur gear stripped, and in order to change the spur gear, I have to take out the whole transmission and split the whole case. Working on the Kyosho Outlaw Rampage, the gears, getting the sand out of the transmission. I've actually done a pretty decent job at cleaning it out so far, so I've got all the sand out of this side. It was pretty caked up, and the gears look to have survived. I just got to get them cleaned up. But getting the spur gear at this thing, pretty kind of a terrible design of how you get at the spur gear. You have to separate the whole case out. So I have to take those 2 screws that just fell out. They came out of this side here. And now I have to pull it out like this to get at the spur. There is no way, and the spur so far is the only gear that's stripped. So I'm going to replace that, but there's no way to get at that spur or adjust your mesh or anything from this side of the case. It's a little bit silly. I had an idea of putting in this one, but I think this one's way too small. Yeah, it is. So that may not work. But the OL009 gear set, if you get the gear set, it gives you all the transmission gears and the spur gear, but I've heard that the spur gear molding is pretty terrible, which is why this happens. A TLR or an associated spur gear, and they will work better, but I gotta get the right size, so we'll do that. So yeah, the whole thing is kind of clamped together like this, and then you can take out a couple of screws, and then you have to slip the backside off, and that allows you to get at the gears that are on this side. And I have a couple of them out. They're in good shape. There's no real problem with those, but I am going to grease them heavily. That's the other problem with this whole design, is that none of the gears in here are greased. They're all completely dry. As well as I had to take this all apart because it was crammed full of sand, because I did run this in a sandy environment. And so there's a couple of things that you're going to want to do to improve that. In order to get at what we need, you have to take off this whole front end assembly, because this has no access to be able to get at what you need. So with this all on here, spur gear goes over this main shaft, but you can't get your spur gear on and off because all the screws you need to access it are tucked in behind under this cover. The other thing is that how they mounted this motor from the factory, they used the fixed mount point holes instead of the slotted one, so the mesh is fixed and it wasn't the best mesh. It's either was wrong mesh or this gear was out of, so it's stripped. Anyway, I'm just going to start some of the rebuild process. I mentioned this before, but when you blow one gear in this transmission, Kyosho doesn't offer just one. You have to buy the whole set. So it's OL009, all the gears in the transmission, and it's a new spur gear. So I'm just going to replace the spur gear, because under my inspection, these other gears are a little bit chewed up, but not bad. They have a little bit of wear marks from running in the sand being dry, but I'm just going to grease the crap out of everything, put it all back together, and then I'll show you what it looks like once that's done. Also, when you pull this axle out, take a picture of its orientation, because its orientation matters. It's not symmetrical. One side has the access screws and the other side does not. This feels fairly dry as well. This is the main differential. Gear diff inside of this, maybe a 5,000 weight oil or a grease. A 1.5 is just a little too small. Like, it's uncomfortably loose. I'm not sure what my next size would be. This is actually a oil-filled gear diff with a 2,000 weight silicone oil. It actually has a seal so that it won't leak out. Anyway, so I don't need to open it up. It actually feels okay, and the screws are a weird size, this 6x8, but it doesn't tell me what the actual head size is, so that's a little weird. But it's more important that I put grease on the outside of the gear, as the inside does have some light fluid in, and a lighter fluid is better for a two-wheel drive, rear-wheel drive vehicle, because it'll let it diff a little bit easier. If you put a thicker oil in, it'll give you more posy traction, but it'll also become possibly harder to drive. I'm just going to leave the stock oils in for now and concentrate on the rest of the gears. Also, one of the reasons why the diff case filled with sand is because the access hole of this motor is because they didn't put a cover over this area here. Maybe in your part supply, or finding an old part from another older car or something like a Tamiya or a Traxxas, and this is this motor plate. So I'm going to be installing that. I'm going to take the motor off, move the screws to the adjustable mesh points, put this in between, which will then block stuff from getting in through. This goes on the other side, by the way. It's going to stop stuff from being able to get into the transmission through the motor. I have the motor off, and this is what I mean. I'm just going to cover up those holes in the motor with a motor plate like that, and that should stop all the crud from getting into the transmission through the motor, which is a fairly common occurrence on the Kyosho Outlaw Rampage Pro. Now this is the orientation of everything on how it goes in. Diff screws facing the plate, and then this idler gear goes in the middle, and this one here runs on the shaft to your slipper. I'm going to grease all of these on the exterior of the teeth. Normally when I build kits, I use their included kind of like high pressure black grease, but I've recently got some of the PPR Slots Shen RC Z-Opt RC heavy grease, so I'm going to put this stuff on, and it should work very well as well. I'm going to slather this all over the gears, and we'll put it back together. They do show some signs of wear from running in the sand, but they seem to be in alright condition, so I am going to keep running them, and then if they do blow later on, I've got the full set. I'm going to put on the replacement spur gear. If the spur gear does fail, I've heard that going to something like an associated spur works very well, as they are a bit better molded. Okay, that should be plenty. So I'm going to put it in the transmission. I have my other two gears pre-greased. I'm going to slip this in, make sure you are putting it in the right way. There we go. Nice. And then I'll wipe off some of the excess because there's a lot on the outsides. This might be a little bit overboard, but I would say that more is better than less. And out of the box, it comes with 0. Also, just make sure that you get as much sand and grit out of your casing as possible. So there's still a little bit of grit down that corner that I'm going to pick out, but I've already cleaned this a few times. Clean it out best you can. I still can't believe that this is all one piece. Whoops, oh, that screw came out of somewhere. If they had have cut this where this plate came off, then you wouldn't have to take the whole transmission apart. Instead of these two little access holes, it should have been this whole piece come off. I don't know why they didn't do that. This is kind of a ridiculous mold. Stock is 84 teeth, and I am replacing it with the 84 tooth replacement spur gear. So we'll keep the same gearing, but if this one goes, then I'm going to be able to adjust my mesh now because I'm using the slotted mounts. So I think I've got the mesh down. There's just a little bit of play in there, just enough. Everything's all torqued down. I did put Loctite on these screws, and then I've got my motor plate installed there so that none of the crud can fly in through the motor and into the transmission, because once you put this plate on, then all the gears are covered, and the gears that are running inside of here are all greased up. So we should be good to go now. One other thing before I clamp this back together, I'm putting grease around the whole exterior of the clamshell of the transmission assembly so that when I put it together, it'll just add a little extra seal around the outside to try and keep everything out of the gears. There we go. You can take this one off to adjust your slipper, but this one doesn't let you do much. But now that I've moved my screws to the adjustable mesh points, I can now adjust my mesh externally. When you buy this vehicle, it doesn't use those mount points, so you can't actually adjust your mesh from outside. Now I can. I would recommend you definitely use those slotted mount points. At this point, the transmission is all back together and we're ready to install it back onto the chassis, and that's actually one of the easiest things to do. It's pretty simple, so it all just hangs off of these 4 links. The top two hold on through one screw through this top triangle mount right here. And then the other two end links mount off of the rear axle mount point right here. Hook those back on to the trailing arms. So we're back in business with the transmission back on the assembly on the chassis, and here's how the trailing arms attach to the rear axle. And the upper mount point is just that one screw and a 5.5 mil nut on the back. And then when you rehook your motor, depending on if you did rearrange your motor mount points, the wire may not be able to tuck under this little hold anymore, but it is red to yellow and blue to black is the wiring. That's if you have the ready to run. If you have the Pro kit, then you've done your own wiring. So I just got to put the rear wheels back on, and we're ready to bench test it. All right guys, we should be back in business. Now to me it always sounded quiet in the air, not under load, but it was when you actually put it under load that you would get a little bit of a squeal, also when it would diff out. Seems all right. Okay, so that's the Kyosho Outlaw Rampage Pro back in business. So in a later video when we get it out and run it again. All right, guys, if you enjoyed this video, hit that like button. If you're new on here, subscribe. If you want to talk to me, leave a comment down below. As always, thanks for watching. Yeah, really kind of unfortunate design decisions made into that rear gearbox just for ease of access, to be able to get at the gears to maintain them and grease them and service them. If one of them drips or something goes wrong with one of the gears, the whole thing's got to come out. You have to split the case. Shouldn't have been that way. They certainly could have designed the case a little bit differently, where you would be able to get at a gear and especially change your spur. You should be able to change your spur without taking the transmission out. That's my opinion. All right, guys, that's it. Thanks for watching.